Now you might go, hey, you do outsourced CFO work. Obviously it's all pros for outsourced CFOs and cons for everyone else. No, there's an objective way to look at this, and there's an appropriate time to shift from one to another in your business journey. As a business owner, I think it's really important to understand what are the pros and cons of different options you have available within your finance team, especially from a leadership perspective. So you could have an internal CFO, you can have an outsourced CFO, you could even have your tax accountant, and I'll explain more around the tax accountant in a moment, because a lot of tax accountants do offer a form of outsourced CFO service. So we're going to look at the pros and cons of each. So first, let's look at an internal CFO and the pros that you could have for an internal CFO. The first one is they're there all the time. They don't have any other clients. They don't have any other distractions. They are there focused purely on your business. So that goes without saying, is that there's going to be insights and time that they're going to invest into things is going to be far greater than someone who's on an outsourced or an external way of doing things. So they can put daily focus into your business. The second one is they can push people. So one of the downsides, and you'll see this in the cons in a moment, one of the downsides of an outsourced CFO or the tax accountant is that it's really easy if you're trying to push something into your business, especially with, dare I say it, lower level team members. It's a lot easier for them to smile and agree when they're with you, and then as soon as you leave, go back and do the opposite to what way they were doing things. So if you're an internal CFO, you can call that out on an ongoing basis. And yes, that sounds a little bit like babysitting and hand-holding, but that degree of accountability is just that much better when you have an internal CFO there. The third element is you can get an industry superstar. The industry you're in, whether it's construction, wholesale, manufacturing, or even more specific than that, you can get someone with 10, 20, 30 years experience working for a competitor and bringing that information across or knowledge across to your business. So you can get someone who is absolutely elite in your industry. So that's a key element there. And the final element is size. Just practically, at a certain point in your business's growth and evolution and growth journey, it's just more practical to have an internal CFO there all the time because of the workload. So they're the pros in terms of having an internal CFO. Some of the cons, firstly, they can get lazy. I've seen circumstances where if you're somewhere for a long period of time, they can get lazy because from an outsourced CFO or from a tax accountant perspective, they're consultants, they're advisors. You can tell them not to come in tomorrow and never come back again, and there's no ramification for that. Whereas with an internal CFO, that's an employee, and the law is in such a way that it's not so easy as just hiring and firing people. So that's one of the downsides. The second one is also just the pure workload as well. So do you have enough workload for a high level individual? And when I say high level in terms of cost, enough workload, or are you risking that there's going to be certain tasks being completed at a lower level by somebody who is very expensive? So that's a question you've got to ask around the workload. And the last one is similar theme, just the cost itself. I think an entry level for a CFO these days is 150 grand, and depending on when you're watching this video, it might be, double that at some point in the future. But it's not going to be a cheap investment. And when you hear the C-suite type of team member, those things don't come cheap. So there's the cost element there. So as you can see, lots of pros, but also there's some cons. Now looking at the outsourced CFO and the pros and the cons there. Now the first one is the investment cost itself. There's probably a degree of a capped cost or an agreed upon cost, or at least an understanding of what that investment is. And the practicality is because it's outsourced, it's highly, highly, highly unlikely to be the same cost or more than what it would be to have an internal CFO. So there's financial savings there, number one. Number two is they are seeing a diverse bunch of clients, most likely. So they can take ideas, experiences that they've had at other places, rather than just being, siloed in a single business. So they might be working in a manufacturing business and go, oh, that worked really well over there. I could use this at another place. Now, the assumption is they're not working for a competitor and there's no ethical problems there, but they're taking an idea that they've applied somewhere and can apply it in your business, and also conversely, know that something might not have worked in the past and not have to have your business go through that same pain. And the other one is they should be motivated. Because they're a consultant, because they're an advisor, there should be no sort of long-term fixed agreement or commitment on your part as a business owner. So they're motivated to continually provide value and high quality work because of the fact that if they don't do it, they're out the door a heck of a lot easier than what it is to get rid of an employee. So they're the main pros of an outsourced CFO. In terms of cons, the first thing is, yes, you are not their only client, or it's very unlikely you are not their only client. So yeah, there might be times where you can't get the person as easily. They're not going to respond as quickly as it is if someone who might be in the next office next to you, or a phone call where you know that 9 times out of 10, they're going to pick up that phone. The second one is, do they know your industry well enough? Do they know the lingo? And yes, there's a lot of financial information that is very consistent in nature. Whether you're doing haircuts or whether you're selling cars, it doesn't matter. But also, do you understand the lingo of that industry? And the other one is feeling like you're always on the clock. We do it here, we charge by the hour, and that is because of how our business model works, to be fair to our clients and also to be fair to ourselves. But it does lead to conversations at times where you have meetings with people and go, look, I'm off the clock now. Let's have a conversation about how was the football, how's the weather, what's going on in the world, and letting them know, hey, look, I'm not charging for this time. But there is also that feeling of I'm always on the clock. And the last element is they're not always there, so they can't always push your team. So as I was saying before, with an internal CFO, one of the pros is they're there all the time to push the team. An outsourced CFO doesn't have that same benefit of being there all the time to push your team. They could potentially smile, i.e. your team, could smile at the idea and know that that person's going to be gone very soon. So lastly, let's look at the pros and cons of using your tax accountant for CFO type work. And as I mentioned before, the pros and cons are very similar to an outsourced CFO with an additional pro and additional con. So quick recap, firstly, the time or the cost might already be capped or agreed upon already. So you know the investment compared to an external CFO is not going to be as great. They're motivated because they're a consultant advisor. If they're not providing value, you can kick them out the door. And the other thing is they bring multiple experiences. They're working with other businesses, other industries, and other insights that they can apply to your business. Now, the fourth element that an outsourced CFO can't add is that they already know you, they already know your structure, and they understand how you work and how you're set up, which can have a really big benefit in terms of who you share your knowledge and information with. And the cons, as I was saying before, very similar to an outsourced CFO. So firstly, the internal push might not be there. Because they're external, they might visit once a month, once a quarter. If you're trying to build an initiative, it's a lot easier for people within the business to ignore, not feel like they're being held accountable, and to be frank, just forget what was being done. So that's a lot easier from a tax accountant perspective. Do they know your industry lingo? Yes, all financial information is consistent in nature, but do they know the lingo of your industry? And also the feeling of like you're always on the clock. So they're the same things as the outsourced CFO. But the other con is CFO is a very specialist field. An outsourced CFO or an internal CFO is spending their life's work in terms of that financial management, financial performance. Your tax accountant by name is also spending a lot of time looking at tax. And what we've found with tax accounting offerings is that it can potentially be just quite high level. So you get a report and a management meeting, but they don't necessarily roll their sleeves up within the business the same way an internal or an external CFO would within the day-to-day operations of your business, especially trying to bring projects to life. So that might be something that's a compromise with using that type of offering. So that's it. That's the pros and cons of an internal CFO, an outsourced CFO, or your tax accountant. So they've all got their strengths, all got their weaknesses, but ultimately what's most important is adding the most value for your business.